In this house, Tiffany, you're nothing but a parasite. My mother's scream shattered the silver spoon silence, her pearls vibrating with a lie that had already cost $500,000. I didn't flinch. I just smiled. Then the heavy oak door burst open, and her billionaire boss snapped the sharpest salute of his life. "Hello, Colonel. I'm here." Before she could even catch her breath, I handed her the bill for every forged signature and stolen memory she ever thought was a secret. But before the reckoning, there was the silent return. The gravel of the driveway crunched beneath the tires of my modest SUV, a sound far too jagged for the manicured silence of Lake Forest. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. Outside, the Illinois autumn was a relentless gray, sweeping dead oak leaves across the Tudor porch in frantic, lonely circles. This house had never been a sanctuary for me. It was a fortress of expectations where I had spent 18 years as the invisible casualty. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, jagged metal of my father's broken pocket watch. It was a habit now, a tactile prayer. True strength isn't about how loud you can scream, I reminded myself. It's about how much you can endure without letting them steal your soul. I stepped out, the wind biting through my jacket, and pulled my small suitcase from the trunk. I didn't expect a welcome mat, but I didn't expect the air to feel this heavy. I'd walked through minefields in the Middle East that felt more honest than the tension behind those oak doors. This was the battlefield I had fled 5 years ago, trading silk for combat boots and a silver spoon for a military commission. I wasn't back for their approval. I was back because I knew the foundation of this house was rotting, and my name was the only thing holding it up, even if the people inside refused to see it. Taking a deep breath, I adjusted my collar and walked toward the entrance. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and expensive lilies, a scent so sharp it burned. Ghislaine didn't hear me come in, or perhaps she chose not to. She stood by the grand staircase, meticulously adjusting a massive floral arrangement for the evening's festivities. When she finally turned, her eyes didn't search for my well-being. They scanned me like a faulty line of code. "Tiffany, you're late," she said, her voice a polished blade. She looked at my plain jeans and my functional jacket with a grimace that bordered on physical pain. "And you look like you've been living in a tent. I have guests arriving in 20 minutes, high-profile guests." I stayed silent, the military discipline acting as a dampener for the old, familiar ache in my chest. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, hand-wrapped tin. "I brought you some tea, Mother. It's a rare botanical blend from the coast. I thought you might like the calming properties." I held it out, a small offering of grace to a woman who only understood the currency of status. Ghislaine barely glanced at it, setting it carelessly on a side table as if it were a piece of junk mail. "Just put it away," she muttered, her mind already back on the seating chart. "We have a standard to maintain tonight, even if you've forgotten what that means." The doorbell chimed, a melodic, rhythmic sound that signaled the start of the execution. Ghislaine's friends, women in cashmere wraps and pearls that cost more than my first 2 years of service, flooded the foyer. I stood there, the daughter who had traveled halfway around the world to be here, but Ghislaine's eyes were frantic, searching for a way to hide the disappointment. She didn't introduce me as a colonel. She didn't even use my last name. Instead, she reached into a nearby closet and pulled out a stained white servant's apron, thrusting it into my hands with a force that made the fabric snap. "Go to the kitchen," she whispered, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of peppermint and desperation. "Serve the tea. If anyone asks, you're a distant relative staying here on charity while you look for work. Don't mention the army. I won't have my reputation ruined by your choices." She then turned to her friends with a radiant, fake smile. "Everyone, this is a young cousin of ours. She's fallen on some hard times, and we've opened our home to her. Isn't it wonderful to be able to give back?" I watched her perform, my heart turning to ice. Have you ever been treated like a stranger in the very place that should have known you best? I took the apron. I didn't argue or shout. A lion doesn't need to roar to prove its power. It simply waits for the moment to strike. I tied the strings behind my back and walked into the kitchen, my mind shifting into tactical observation. As I prepared the tray, I moved with a precision that went unnoticed by the laughing women in the parlor. Passing Ghislaine's private desk, I noticed a silver tray overflowing with mail. Beneath a heavy crystal paperweight, I saw it. A stack of overdue notices with red-stamped warnings from the bank. The woman calling me a beggar was the one whose empire was built on a house of cards. The irony wasn't lost on me as I carried the tea service into the room. I moved like a ghost, pouring Earl Grey into porcelain cups that were likely being used as collateral for a debt I hadn't yet fully measured. I looked at Ghislaine, laughing at a joke about a local charity, and felt a profound, hollow sadness for her. She was so obsessed with the shadow of wealth that she had murdered the reality of love. Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it, I thought. But even a violet has limits when the heel tries to steal its name. My mother had no idea that the servant in her kitchen was the only person with the security clearance to see her crimes. By the time I finished the first round of service, the parlor was buzzing with gossip. I stood near the shadows of the hallway, my military phone vibrating silently in my pocket. A quick scan of the debt notices had confirmed my worst fear. The signatures on the largest loans weren't hers. They were clunky, desperate forgeries of my own name. She hadn't just ignored me. She had tried to liquidate my future to fund her vanity. I prepared myself for the evening, knowing the parasite label was coming. I overheard Ghislaine telling a guest that the colonel she'd mentioned earlier, the one she was so proud of, was a family friend, definitely not the girl currently clearing the empty sugar packets. The Lake Forest mansion didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a tomb of secrets. It was 2 a.m., the kind of hour where the silence is so heavy it hums in your ears. I waited until the distant plumbing stopped rattling, signaling that Ghislaine had finally retreated into her wine-induced slumber. Moving like a ghost through the shadows, my military training took over, shifting weight to the outside of my feet. Avoiding the floorboards I knew would groan under the slightest pressure, I descended the stairs, each step a calculated risk. The scent of lavender candles from the party had faded, replaced by the damp, metallic tang of Lake Michigan air creeping through the vents. I wasn't a guest here. I was an operative in enemy territory. The air in the basement was thick with the scent of old paper and cedar, a dry, suffocating perfume of the past. I clicked on my high-intensity tactical flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust motes like a white laser. The basement had become a graveyard for everything Ghislaine deemed unfashionable, including my father's quiet dignity. I saw his old heavy oak desk pushed into a corner, relegated to this damp dark, while Celine's vanity mirrors occupied the sunlight upstairs. My father used to say that a man's word is his bond, but a written legacy is his shield for those he leaves behind. Standing before that desk, I felt a sharp pang of longing. I was looking for his shield in a house ruled by a sword. I began a systematic search, my fingers moving with the precision of a document recovery specialist. I wasn't just looking for records, I was looking for the truth they tried to bury. My flashlight scanned the grain of the wood, looking for the imperfections I remembered from childhood. Have you ever gone looking for a piece of your past, only to realize someone tried to paint over it? It's a hollow feeling, like reaching for a hand that isn't there. I focused on the lower left drawer, feeling for the hidden latch behind the loose panel. A secret game Dad had taught me when I was 10. The wood resisted, swollen from the humidity, before finally clicking open. Inside the hidden compartment sat a weathered manila envelope untouched for years. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled out the document inside, the original last will and testament. It was dated 3 days before his passing, much later than the official version Ghislaine had filed in probate court. I laid it flat on the desk, my flashlight illuminating the ink. The original was clear. It left the Lake Forest property and a significant trust directly to me. The forged version Ghislaine used had neatly wiped me from the ledger, giving everything to herself and Celine. This wasn't just a family dispute. Under Illinois law, this was criminal fraud, a cold-blooded erasure of my existence. I stared at the paper, the ink blurring as the reality sank in. She didn't just ignore me. She systematically liquidated my birthright to fund her social delusions. I noticed a small photo tucked into the back of the envelope, a picture of a young, smiling Ghislaine holding me as an infant. I ran my thumb over her faded face, a whisper escaping my lips into the cold basement air. I don't hate you for the money, Mother. I'm just so sorry you thought our love was something you had to buy or steal. Even in the face of this betrayal, I felt a crushing pity. I chose truth over vengeance, seeking justice for Dad's wishes rather than my own pocketbook. The weight of the truth settled over me like a lead shroud, cold and immovable. Ghislaine hadn't just stolen the land, she had stolen my sense of belonging, turning my own history into a weapon against me. I sat on an old crate, holding the original will, the light of my flashlight reflected in the polished silver of my father's broken watch. Character is what you do in the dark when no one is watching, I reminded myself. But truth is a fire that eventually burns through any darkness, no matter how much paint you use to hide it. I pulled out my phone, using an encrypted military app to scan the document directly to a secure server. I worked with tactical speed, ensuring the original was replaced by a high-quality replica I had prepared, while the forgery went back into the main safe upstairs. My hands were steady, the military calm overriding the daughter's grief. I climbed the stairs, the darkness of the house no longer intimidating but familiar. Just as I reached the basement door, a sharp sound echoed from above, the rhythmic, predatory click of Ghislaine's high heels on the hardwood. She was awake. She was moving. I flattened myself against the wall, my breath held, as she passed the hallway toward the kitchen. She thought I was a beggar she could toss aside, but she had no idea I was the rightful owner of the floor she was walking on. I waited until her footsteps receded before slipping back toward my room, but my foot brushed something near the trash can in the hall. I lowered my light. It was a recent credit card statement, discarded carelessly. My eyes locked onto a $50,000 charge for Celine's branding project. The signature at the bottom was a clumsy, looping imitation of my own name. The debt I had seen earlier wasn't just a mistake, it was an ongoing theft, a parasite feeding on my credit score while calling me the bloodsucker. I stared at that forged Tiffany on the paper until the letters burned into my retinas. The storm wasn't just coming, I was the one bringing the rain. The grand dining room of the Lake Forest mansion was a masterpiece of artifice, a gilded cage designed to project a wealth that no longer existed. Silver candelabras stood like frozen sentries on the mahogany table, their flickering flames reflected in the polished surface of fine china. The air was heavy, a suffocating blend of slow-roasted lamb and the sharp, acidic tang of vintage wine. I stood at the edge of the table, the stained white servant's apron still tied over my plain cotton shirt. I was an uninvited ghost at a feast I was technically paying for. Have you ever felt the weight of a room that wants to crush you simply for existing? The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was a countdown. Ghislaine and Celine were already seated, their postures rigid and regal. They sipped from crystal goblets, the liquid inside swirling like blood in the candlelight. I knew that wine. I knew the merchant. It had been purchased through a credit line Ghislaine had opened using a forged military power of attorney. Every swallow they took was a theft, yet they sat there with the practiced ease of the righteous. I watched them, my military training keeping my breathing shallow and my face a mask of stone. It's a strange thing to witness the vanity of people who have traded their souls for a lifestyle they can't afford. True wealth isn't measured by the gold in your bank, but by the integrity in your soul. A beggar with a clean heart is richer than a queen with a stolen crown. Despite the thick wall of malice separating us, I stepped forward. I reached for the crystal pitcher, the cold glass sweating against my palm, and leaned down to pour water into my mother's glass. It was a small, quiet gesture of duty, a fragment of the grace my father had tried to instill in this house. My knuckles brushed against the lace tablecloth, a tactile reminder of the home that once held laughter instead of ledger debts. I looked at Celine, hoping for a spark of sisterly recognition, a single look that said she remembered when we used to play in the garden. Instead, she adjusted her ring and checked her reflection in a silver spoon. There was nothing there but cold, digital calculation. Ghislaine set her glass down with a sharp, echoing click. The sound sliced through the hum of the cooling vents. She didn't look at the food. She looked at me, her eyes narrow and filled with a disdain so pure it felt physical. "We were discussing the maintenance fees for the estate, Tiffany," she began, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. Celine scoffed, propping her phone against a salt shaker to film a lifestyle snippet for her followers, completely ignoring the person standing 2 feet away. They were performing for an audience of thousands while failing the only person who actually mattered. The monologue continued, a rehearsed litany of the high costs of their status and the burden of family members who do not contribute. Ghislaine's face was a mask of aristocratic suffering. In this family, Tiffany, you are nothing except a parasite. She finally spat, the word hitting the air like a slap. You've spent years hiding in the army, playing soldier, and now you come back to suck the life out of my reputation and my home. I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. The years in the field had taught me that the person who believes the insult is the only one who can be hurt by it. I simply smiled, a calm, chilling expression that made Celine's hand tremble slightly as she held her phone. That project, that smile was my shield. I realized her words were merely a facade to conceal her guilt. The real parasite was the woman wearing the pearl necklace bought under a false identity. Her cruel words hung in the air like a poisonous fog, but I breathed through it, indifferently and analytically. I watched her heart pound in her chest, the sign of a liar beginning to fear the silence of her victim. If you've ever been slandered by someone you once loved, you know that silence isn't a sign of weakness. It's the sound of a trap being set. My mother was digging her own grave, and she was too busy screaming to realize she was standing in it. Celine reached into her designer handbag and pushed a crisp white document across the table. It slid over the mahogany with a dry, reptilian hiss. "We need your signature on this guarantor agreement," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. It was an application for a new $200,000 loan for her influencer branding project. The bank had started flagging Ghislaine's previous applications, and they needed my official military-backed signature to bypass the security protocols. They weren't asking. They were demanding a ransom for my presence in the house. Ghislaine leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "Think of it as your only way to pay rent for being a parasite," she hissed. The psychological warfare was blatant. Emotional blackmail served on a silver platter. They threatened to leak a story to their social circle that I had been dishonorably discharged for theft if I didn't comply. They wanted to destroy my career to fund a vanity project that would be forgotten by next season. My eyes scanned the fine print. I saw the predatory interest rates. I saw the hidden clause that would grant Ghislaine power of attorney over my entire military pension. They weren't just asking for money. They were trying to liquidate my entire future. I reached out and touched the paper, my fingertips tracing the lines where they expected me to sign. The clink of the silver was the only sound in the room. I felt a surge of strength, the kind that comes when you realize the person you are facing has no power over you, because you no longer fear their opinion. I gently slid the document back toward the center of the table. I spoke softly, my voice carrying the weight of a command. "I would give you my last dollar if you asked with love, Celine. But I will not give you my soul to feed your pride." The humanitarian limit had been reached. I had offered them grace, and they had offered me a noose. Ghislaine's chair shrieked against the hardwood as she stood up, her face flushing a deep, ugly purple. She looked ready to strike me, her hand curling into a fist. "You ungrateful little—" she started, but the sentence was severed by a sound from the driveway. It was a distant, heavy thud, the unmistakable sound of a luxury SUV door closing with the finality of a prison gate. I looked at my watch. It was 7:59 p.m. Sterling was precisely on time. The parasite was about to reclaim the nest, and the predators were about to find out they were the ones on the menu. The girl they tried to bury in the basement of their memories was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew that her value was never theirs to define. They had spent the last hour trying to erase my identity, but tonight they would realize that I was the only thing keeping their world from being seized by the truth. I adjusted my apron, the fabric feeling like armor. Ghislaine smoothed her hair, her expression shifting back to a practiced mask of hospitality, unaware that the savior she was expecting was actually my witness. The storm had arrived, and I was the one who had opened the door. The dining room door swung shut behind me, but the foyer offered no escape. Celine moved with a frantic speed I hadn't seen from her in years, blocking the base of the grand staircase, while Ghislaine hovered by the mahogany doors, her face a grotesque mask of fear and fury. The house felt smaller now, the shadows stretching across the polished oak floors like the bars of a cell. I stood in the center of the foyer, my suitcase still in the kitchen, feeling the air thicken with their desperation. They weren't my family anymore. They were cornered animals, and their desperation had turned them predatory. It was a suffocating realization that the woman who gave me life was now trying to auction it off to the highest bidder. Ghislaine's voice rose to a shrill pitch, echoing off the high ceilings. "You aren't going anywhere, Tiffany, not until those loan documents are signed." She gripped the doorframe so hard her knuckles turned a sickly white. "I'll call the military police. I'll tell them you broke into my safe. I'll tell them you stole family heirlooms." I looked at her and felt a profound, weary pity. I recalled a lesson from my early days at the academy. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with the biggest gun, but the one who has convinced themselves they are the victim of their own greed. I forced myself to breathe, maintaining a haunting calm that seemed to unnerve them more than any shout. "Mother," I said softly, my voice steady. "If you tell me the truth about the debt right now, I will help you find a legal way out. I will use my own savings to settle the forgeries. But if you keep lying, I cannot follow you into that darkness." I was offering her a hand before the storm hit, a final chance to choose blood over paper. I wanted to believe there was still a shred of the mother I remembered buried beneath the cashmere and the lies. But Ghislaine only scoffed, her eyes darting toward Celine as if looking for a weapon. Celine stepped forward, her sneer deepening as she noticed the thin silver chain of my father's pocket watch hanging from my pocket. It was the only thing I had consistently touched since I arrived, my silent anchor in this sea of artifice. "Is this what you're so worried about, Tiffany?" she hissed, her eyes gleaming with a malicious light. "This old piece of junk? You think this makes you better than us?" Before I could even process her movement, she reached out and snatched the watch from my hand. It was a sudden, violent violation of the only space I had left for myself. She held the watch up, laughing at the tarnished silver, and then, with a sharp, deliberate flick of her wrist, she hurled it against the marble floor. The sound of the glass shattering and the delicate, vintage gears spilling out echoed through the mansion like a gunshot. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. I stared down at the remains of my father's only legacy, the tiny brass wheels rolling across the stone like teardrops. I felt the last thin thread of my childhood attachment snap. The anchor of hope was gone, and in its place, a cold, terrifying clarity emerged from the depths of my soul. I didn't scream. I didn't strike her. Instead, I knelt slowly, my movements deliberate and military precise. I picked up a single bent gear and stood up, my expression shifting into something that made Ghislaine recoil a step. Some things must break completely so that something stronger can be built in their place. My father's voice wasn't in that metal. It was in the justice I was about to serve. Looking back now, that was the moment Tiffany the daughter died, and the colonel took full command of the field. I wasn't panicking anymore. I was free. I checked my modern digital military watch, 7:55 p.m. The time for sentiment had passed. I began to straighten my clothes, my posture shifting into a rigid, authoritative stance they didn't recognize. They say a daughter's love is unconditional, but what happens when that love is used as a weapon against her? Have you ever had to say goodbye to a memory just to survive the reality? I looked at Celine, who was now beginning to realize she had made a catastrophic tactical error. Under Illinois law, property destruction and intimidation are valid grounds for immediate legal intervention, but they were the least of her worries. The headlights of a heavy black SUV swept across the living room windows, blinding Ghislaine for a split second. The doorbell rang, not a polite chime, but a sharp, rhythmic command that signaled the arrival of the storm. I adjusted my collar and looked my mother in the eye. "The parasite is leaving, Mother," I whispered, my voice as cold as the autumn wind outside. "But I'm taking the house with me." I reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door, my fingers steady and sure. I knew exactly what was waiting on the other side. Ghislaine began to frantically shuffle the loan documents, trying to hide them under a decorative vase, her hands shaking so violently she dropped several pages. She still thought she was welcoming a savior to dinner, unaware that the man outside was the very person she had tried to defraud using my name. She was opening the door to her own reckoning, and I was the one who had invited it in. As the door swung open, the scent of the cold night air flooded the foyer, and I stepped aside to let the truth enter. As the cold night wind swept through the hall, The atmosphere shifted from icy confrontation to frantic despair. My mother looked at me, and I saw she was genuinely terrified. It wasn't the fear of a mother worried about her child. It was the horror of a seasoned gambler realizing that the parasite at the table was actually the house, and the house was tightening its grip. Her gaze shifted from my rigid, stern posture to the front door, then back to the designer handbag clutched in her trembling hands. She realized that the old rules, shame, psychological manipulation, and domestic violence, no longer held any power over me. In a move so swift it betrayed a lifetime of calculated deception, Ghislaine lunged for her bag. I watched with a sense of tragic detachment as she pulled out a velvet jewelry box, the one containing her grandmother's diamond necklace. With a practiced, jagged motion, she shoved it deep into the pocket of my trench coat hanging by the door. Then, her face contorted into a mask of feigned hysteria, she grabbed the foyer telephone and dialed 911. Her voice erupted into a shrill, piercing scream that echoed off the high Tudor ceilings. "Help me! Please! My daughter! She's unstable! She's stealing everything and threatening my life!" Celine rushed to her side, instantly picking up the cue. My sister huddled against Ghislaine, letting out choreographed sobs that filled the background of the emergency call. It was a masterpiece of toxic theater. I stood perfectly still, my hands visible and open, my breathing rhythmic. A house divided against itself cannot stand. But a house built on lies will eventually crush everyone inside when the foundation gives way. I felt a profound, heavy pity for this woman. She would rather see me in handcuffs, my career and honor obliterated, than admit her own financial ruin. Even as the low, rhythmic wail of sirens began to bleed into the quiet lake forest night, I didn't move. The high-contrast blue and red lights began to splash against the frosted glass of the front door, casting long, erratic shadows across the oak floor. "Mother," I said, my voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. "I would have forgiven every cent of the debt. I would have quietly settled the forgeries, but I cannot forgive the murder of my character." I stood my ground, a soldier awaiting a different kind of combat, knowing that this was the moment the bridge between us finally turned to ash. The front door burst open, the wood hitting the stopper with a violent crack. 2 local police officers stepped into the foyer, their hands resting on their holsters, eyes scanning the chaos. Ghislaine didn't hesitate. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her face wet with artificial tears. "There! That's her! Tiffany! I found her rifling through my private safe. She has my mother's diamonds in her pocket right now." The officers looked at me, a woman in plain clothes, standing silent and motionless, and then at the weeping victim in her silk blouse. One officer stepped toward me, his face a mask of professional suspicion. He reached into my coat pocket, and just as Ghislaine had intended, his fingers closed around the velvet box. He pulled it out, the diamonds catching the flickering light of the police cruisers outside. Celine let out a sharp, audible gasp, clutching her chest. "Oh, Tiffany! How could you?" she whimpered. It was the perfect trap, designed to end my career before the sun came up. In the eyes of the law, I was caught red-handed. I didn't resist when the officer moved to secure my arm. I simply looked him in the eye, my voice as cold as steel. "Officer, before you proceed, I suggest you look up." I tilted my head toward the corner of the ceiling where a small, blinking lens was tucked behind a decorative crown molding. "Check the cloud-based timestamps on the foyer's hidden security camera, the one my mother forgot I installed for my father years ago. You will see her place that box in my pocket exactly 30 seconds before you breached the door." The silence that followed was absolute. I could see the gears turning in the officer's mind as he glanced from the camera to Ghislaine's suddenly pale face. Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it isn't going away. I realized that to protect the honor I had spent a decade building, I had to finally let the law see the rot that had consumed this family. I stood there unblinking as the second officer moved toward the security hub. This was the moment of no return. The tension in the foyer was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made even the officers hesitate. But the real shift occurred when the heavy oak door was pushed open once more. A man in a tailored navy suit stepped into the light, his presence instantly commanding the room. It was Sterling. He stopped mid-stride, his sharp eyes taking in the police, the sobbing women, and me, standing in the center of the wreckage with my dignity intact. The cinematic swell of the moment was undeniable. The Titan had arrived. Ghislaine's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The victim mask vanished, replaced by the fawning smile of a desperate socialite. She rushed towards Sterling, her hands fluttering like wounded birds, trying to block his view of me. "Mr. Sterling, oh, thank goodness you're here. I am so embarrassed. My daughter, she's had a complete mental breakdown. The police are just taking her away for her own safety." She reached for his hand, her voice a sugary, frantic trill. Sterling didn't even look at her. He ignored her outstretched hand as if she were a ghost and walked straight toward me. The officers, recognizing the stature of the man, a powerful CEO and a pillar of the Chicago business community, immediately stepped back. Have you ever seen the moment a liar realizes the person they are talking to knows the one person they fear most? It's the silence that follows the scream. The air left the room as Sterling stopped inches from me. He looked at the officer holding the necklace, then looked at the gear from my father's watch still clutched in my hand. His voice, when it came, was a booming, authoritative rumble that shook the crystal chandelier. "Unhand her immediately," he commanded, his eyes boring into the officer. "Do you have any idea who you are touching?" Ghislaine's jaw dropped, her eyes widening in a slow-motion realization of total defeat. She stared at Sterling, then at her parasite daughter, as the world she had built on forged signatures and stolen memories finally began to collapse. The air in the foyer crystallized as the heavy silence of a battlefield descended. Sterling walked past a stunned Ghislaine, as if she were a piece of discarded furniture. He stopped 2 paces from me, his face shifting from the coldness of a CEO to the sharp, reverent precision of a soldier. He snapped his heels together, the sound echoing like a hammer against stone, and delivered a crisp, formal salute. "Hello, Colonel Tiffany," he said, his voice resonant and steady. "I am here as requested to finalize the audit of the diversionary funds." The fallout was instantaneous. The local police officers, recognizing the weight of that single word, Colonel, immediately lowered their voices. They didn't just step back, they lowered the jewelry box as if it had become radioactive. Camera flashes from Celine's dropped phone flickered on the floor, illuminating the slow-motion collapse of Ghislaine's arrogance. The police officers exchanged looks of deep unease, realizing they had been recruited for a domestic frame-up against a high-ranking officer. After Sterling produced his credentials, they didn't just apologize, they practically vanished into the night, eager to distance themselves from the legal firestorm about to ignite. I returned the salute with a slight, weary nod. I thought about the years I had spent hiding my rank, hoping my family would love the girl without the title. It was a hollow hope. I realized then that a uniform only commands the body, but character is what commands the soul. I turned to the officers before they departed, thanking them for their service and apologizing for the confusion caused by my mother's unwell state. Even at my limit, I couldn't bring myself to let them drag her out in cuffs. I chose a private reckoning over a public execution, not for her sake, but for the memory of my father. The eye of the storm had passed, leaving only the cold reality of the ledger. I stepped to the foyer table and opened my military-grade tablet. With a few taps, I wirelessly projected a series of files onto the massive smart screen in the living room. The blue light washed over the room, highlighting the red-stamped fraud watermarks on every page. I pulled a physical red envelope from my bag, the unpaid bill, and handed it directly to my mother. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the paper. The screen displayed the $500,000 in forged loans, the Celine branding invoices, and the diverted military pension funds she had been skimming using my digital signature. I explained the logic with a clinical, detached tone. I had let the debt accumulate to see if she would ever stop out of conscience. I had given her months to reach out, to confess, to ask for help. She never did. Ghislaine tried to stammer about family sacrifices and the burden of the estate, but I cut her off gently. "Mother, love doesn't keep a ledger of what it can take. It only knows what it can give. You called me a parasite while you were feeding on my very name to buy these walls." The truth is not a weapon meant to hurt people, but a light to show them where they are lost. Looking back, my silence wasn't weakness. It was a long-suffering hope that she would choose her daughter over her pearls. Have you ever waited for someone to do the right thing, only to realize they don't even know what right looks like anymore? The sorrow I felt wasn't for the money. It was for the woman who had traded her child's trust for a Tudor mansion she was about to lose. Sterling stepped forward, his voice like grinding gravel. He informed Ghislaine that the Project Sentinel audit he was conducting had flagged her department weeks ago. Ghislaine, as of this moment, you are suspended without pay pending a federal investigation into bank fraud and identity theft, he declared. The finality of his words seemed to drain the color from the room. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut after 5 years of patient waiting. In a desperate, manic move, Ghislaine screeched that she would go to the press. She threatened to claim I used my military rank to bully a poor, grieving widow. I didn't argue. I simply looked at Sterling, then back at the living room screen. The image shifted. The original will of my father, which I had found in the basement, appeared in high resolution. The forged version she had used in probate was displayed right next to it, the discrepancies highlighted in neon yellow. If you go to the press, Mother, the world will learn not just about the debt, I said, my voice echoing in the hollow foyer. They will learn how you stole my father's last wish. I've already bought the deed to this house from the bank this afternoon. You aren't being bullied. You're being evicted from your own lies. Justice is like a slow-moving river. You can dam it up for a lifetime, but eventually, it will find its way to the sea. I offered her a single choice: sign a full confession and seek professional counseling, or face the FBI. Ghislaine collapsed into a velvet chair, her face a mask of ruined pride. Celine, seeing her lifestyle evaporating, suddenly lunged for the tablet on the table, her fingernails clawing at the screen in a futile attempt to smash the digital evidence. Sterling's hand shot out, catching her wrist in a firm, unbreakable grip. I turned away from them, looking out the window at the dark lake forest skyline. The mansion was no longer my home. It was just a collection of expensive bricks. The walls that once echoed with insults were finally silent, but the quietest sound of all was the crumbling of my mother's pride. The girl they tried to erase is gone, replaced by a woman who knows that her value was never theirs to define. I stood in the center of the foyer, watching the orange glow of the Illinois sunset bleed through the clear-story windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the mahogany. Sterling caught my eye and gave a sharp, subtle nod toward the front lawn. Outside, the rhythmic strobe of amber lights from the sheriff's cruisers signaled that the finality of the law had arrived. As the legal owner of the deed, having settled the emergency foreclosure with funds they never knew I possessed, I stepped forward to present the formal eviction notice. The transition from a home to a crime scene happened in a heartbeat. Under Illinois law, the evidence of Ghislaine's criminal fraud and my verified ownership meant the house was to be secured immediately. Celine's voice tore through the quiet, a jagged scream about her unreplaceable influencer gear and designer handbags. The deputies remained unmoved, their boots heavy on the hardwood as they explained she could only take one suitcase of essentials. The locks were already being changed, the metallic click of the tumblers sounding like the final period at the end of a very long, painful sentence. Ghislaine didn't scream like Celine. She crumbled. She clung to the curved banister of the grand staircase, her knuckles white, her face a ruin of mascara and broken pride. "Tiffany, you're killing me," she sobbed, her voice a thin, desperate rasp. "How can you do this to your own mother?" I stood my ground, my posture rigid, my heart a complex knot of grief and resolve. A boundary is not an act of hate. It is the highest form of self-respect for both the giver and the receiver. I watched the movers place yellow tape over the safe I had opened the night before. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick, and you cannot save people from a fire they keep starting themselves. The process was rhythmic and cold. I watched the lights being switched off room by room, the grand Tudor mansion returning to the darkness from which it came. It was a monument to greed, a tomb for a family that chose status over substance. My mother's pleas grew quieter as she realized the theater was over. I had spent years being the invisible parasite in their eyes, but as the doors were sealed, it became clear who the Foundation really was. Without my silent support, the entire structure had simply folded in on itself. Before the deputies led Ghislaine toward the door, I took a step toward the mantel. I placed a small, plain white envelope there, its starkness contrasting with the ornate carvings of the wood. It wasn't money for pearls or a bridge loan for another season of vanity. Inside was the deed to a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, safe part of town, paid for in full, and the business card of a reputable mental health professional. I looked her in the eye, seeing the woman I once worshipped through the lens of a colonel who had seen the world's true ugliness. "I'm not leaving you on the street because you're my mother," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the old tremors. "But I'm not letting you stay here because you don't know how to be a mother. I've paid for your peace, Ghislaine. Now you have to find your own." It was the hardest thing I'd ever said, a mercy that felt like a blade. I was not her enemy. I was her consequence. True forgiveness doesn't mean the relationship stays the same. It means you've decided the pain will no longer dictate your future. Celine stopped her hysterics then. She looked at the envelope, then at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of genuine fear and realization in her eyes. The brand was gone. The person was all that remained, and she looked terrified of the mirror. I reached into my pocket and handed her a business card for a job placement agency I had vetted. "It's time to stop being a brand and start being a person, Celine," I told her. The sisterly love I felt was buried deep, but it was there, manifesting as the tough love she had never received. The sunset was a bruised purple and gold by the time I walked out onto the porch. I felt the weight of the mansion lifting from my shoulders with every step I took away from the door. I left the new set of keys with Sterling, who accepted them with a silent, respectful squeeze of my shoulder. I didn't look back at the windows or the Tudor gables. In the palm of my hand, I held the tiny, broken silver gears of my father's watch. They didn't feel like a tragedy anymore. They felt like a release. I stepped into the back of the SUV, the interior smelling of leather and cold air. Sterling closed the door with a final, crisp click and gave a respectful nod to the driver. As the vehicle pulled away, the camera of my mind panned out, seeing the Lake Forest skyline and the vast, shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan. The gold and red light reflected off the water, symbolizing not an end, but a necessary dawn. They called me a parasite, but I was the foundation. Now that I've walked away, I'm curious to see if they can finally learn to stand on their own. Just as the SUV reached the main highway, leaving the Tudor tomb behind, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a high-priority, encrypted notification from the Pentagon. My eyes scanned the text, my professional mask snapping back into place instantly. "Colonel Tiffany, your presence is required for the next phase. The mission has changed." I closed the phone and looked out at the darkening road ahead. The girl they tried to erase was gone, and the woman who replaced her was ready for a much larger theater of war.